Hello and welcome to the first Fireside Chat series hosted by the Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Access to Life Committee. Our honoree today is Dr. Clive Callender, and this session will be moderated by Dr. Silas Norman. Before we begin the main presentation, we have a few housekeeping notes to help you engage with today's discussion. There is currently a viewership polling question displayed for the audience. Please take a moment to answer this question while we finish the remaining announcements. This webinar is being recorded and the archive will be available within 24 to 48 hours after the session. Please note that your lines all have been muted so that only the presenters can be heard for the archived recording. If you have a question for our panelists, we encourage you to participate by using the Q&A section of Zoom webinar panel to submit your questions for consideration. Questions submitted via the chat section may be missed during the presentation. And finally, when you log off at the conclusion of today's session, you will see a link to a short survey to complete. Please fill out this survey to help us keep our content current and engaging. I'll now turn the session over to our moderator, Dr. Silas Norman, to begin our presentation.
Melissa, thank you. And good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. Thank you for joining us. This is the first in a series of educational offerings from the AST Ideal Committee. These fireside chats are an opportunity to highlight the contributions of diverse members of our transplant community and to learn about some of the diversity challenges and improvements in transplantation, as well as just learn about some of the experience of some of our leaders in transplantation. We're very fortunate this afternoon to kick off our initial fireside chat with Dr. Clive Callender. Dr. Callender is the LaSalle D. LaFalle Jr. Professor of Surgery at Howard University. He's a former chair of the Department of Surgery and longtime director of the transplant program at Howard University. In addition, Dr. Callender is the founder of the Minority Organ Tissue Transplant Education Program, and we hope to talk about that a bit today. So welcome, Dr. Callender, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to participate with you today.
Wonderful, wonderful. And I wonder if we might just start with a little background, if you might kind of tell us what led to your decision to go into medicine and to become a surgeon?
Very interestingly, a non-traditional pathway. I think as I am a member of the admission committee, that my answer is not going to be liked by many, but basically I decided at the age of 7, after hearing a minister talk about how you could minister to the souls and bodies of mankind by becoming a medical missionary. So at the age of 7, I was inspired to become a medical missionary. So that's when it all began for me.
And you did some mission work prior to surgery, is that correct?
As a matter of fact, from the time I was 7, that was my goal. And in 1970, my life dream came true. And I was able to go to Africa and spend 9 months with my wife and go into the mission field. And that was the culmination of my life's dream come true. So that's probably the most exciting period of my life up to that point.
Okay.
Now you might ask, well, what happened? How come I didn't stay as a medical missionary? How come I became a transplant surgeon? But what happened is when I went away for 9 months to Port Harcourt, Nigeria, when I came back, I had lost 50 pounds and began to wonder what was wrong. They did all kinds of medical tests and actually found nothing. But then I wondered, is this the kind of life I should be as a medical missionary? So I came back to the United States, and as I thought about it, I wondered about another option. And I decided I'd go back to the missionary field. Went back for 3 months. This time, I lost 25 pounds and contracted malaria. And so I decided that maybe my mission was going to be in the United States, not in Africa after all. And so that's why I became a transplant surgeon because my initial choice as a medical missionary didn't seem to be associated with living.
Fair enough. Fair enough. And then how did you make that decision then to go into surgery, and what led you into transplantation specifically?
Well, let me tell you how it all began. Actually, William Mattori is a surgeon at Howard University. And before going to Africa, he introduced me to doing animal transplants. And so when I came back from Africa with a little trepidation about continuing in that vein, I thought about transplantation. And I had a classmate who had worked with Big John Nigerian at the University of Minnesota. And he suggested that if I was interested in transplant, he was the man I should train with. And so around that time, members from the National Institutes of Health came to Howard. And they offered the opportunity to, if I decided I wanted to do it, to go to University of Minnesota and do transplant training. It was a field I knew nothing about. And it was at that time, I didn't know there were any other African Americans in transplantation. And so I thought general surgery was nice, but it wasn't as challenging as I wanted. And transplant was new, creative, innovative. And so I decided that would be the area I would go if I wouldn't follow the initial plan of being a medical missionary. And so with that in mind, I came back from Africa and decided I would do a transplant fellowship for 2 years, and then come back and start a transplant program at Howard University.
Wonderful. And would you tell me a little bit about the program you established at Howard University? Because I think you established both a dialysis program as well as the transplant program. And maybe tell a little bit about setting that up, some of the challenges.
Yeah, actually, what happened is the same Bill Mattori who introduced me to animal transplants introduced me to dialysis. And his work, along with Martin Dillard and Adrian Hostin and Limonada Cruz, and also with Georgia Dunstan, we then had a dialysis transplant immunogenetic center, the first African American center in the world, probably. And so that was something that we put together in 1973, the Dialysis Transplant Immunogenetic Center. And actually, because of a lot of help, we were able to get funded as a immunogenetic and Howard University Immunogenetic and Transplant Center. And so it's been something that kind of happened. I was thrilled to have the opportunity when I went to Minnesota and spent 2 years with John Nigerian and Richard Simmons. That was quite an experience. One of the things that I'll never forget about that experience with John Nigerian, he was the first person I met who actually never saw color or complexion. He treated all of us the same, regardless of what language we spoke or what complexion we were. And it was there I saw diversity there in the University of Minnesota. We had people of all kinds of complexions and languages. And with him and John Nigerian and Richard Simmons, they taught me everything I needed to know about running a transplant center.
Interesting, interesting. And then you did some work in Pittsburgh as well, yes?
Say again?
You did some work in Pittsburgh with Dr. Starzo.
Right,
well,
right. Okay, you know everything, don't you?
I try to
so I learned to do kidney transplants, and at the time they weren't doing hardly any liver transplants or pancreas transplants. And so after I did my work as the kidney transplant, I decided I wanted to expand to liver transplant. And so I then went to work with Tom Starzl. And so I learned to do kidney transplants with John Nigerian and Richard Simmons, and learned to do liver transplants with Tom Starzl. So those were the eminent figures in transplantation at that time. So I got to learn with the best. It was also interesting that in Minnesota, while I was there, I met for the first time the other and the first African-American transplant surgeon, Samuel Kuntz. He came to give a presentation at the University of Minnesota. And it was then that I realized there was another Black, and he was the first African-American transplant surgeon. So eventually followed by Joe Alexander, who was the second African-American transplant surgeon, but who actually, after he left the military, didn't do any more transplants. So then I became the third African-American transplant surgeon. And then when Sam died, because of complications from hypertension, that left me as the senior African-American transplant surgeon, and they gave me the opportunity to accomplish some of the many things that I've been able to accomplish in my life and in my career.
Andy, I wonder, just thinking about those accomplishments, of course, I think we would be remiss without talking about MOTAP, which I think has been so transformative. So I wonder if you might just spend a few minutes talking about how you decided to establish MOTAP, what MOTAP is for the people who may not know, and some of the various things that MOTAP has accomplished over the last 30 years.
Well, it's interesting because it really began in 1978, because that's when the members of the Southeastern Organ Procurement Foundation came to me. And because Sam was gone and I was the senior African-American transplant surgeon, they identified data that was startling and shocking. And the data was that 70% of the people on dialysis in the United States were African-American, and the southern part of the United States were African-American. But yet less than 5% were donors. And they came to me with that data. Also, at the same time they came to me with that data, they asked me if I would help and become part of the solution to the problem. And I indicated I'd be glad to. Unfortunately, about 6 months later, they came back to me and said, sorry, Clive, but we don't have any funds. So even though we'd like you to help, we can't do anything about it. And so, but the data was so remarkable and so startling that I joined with James Bateman, eminent psychologist. And we both queried, why is it that we're so disproportionately afflicted and affected with the disease, but really want to become donors? He, being the eminent psychologist that he was, he and his students and myself decided we would put a grant together and ask Howard University, since CF wouldn't give us any money, went to Howard University and begged for money, and they gave us $500. And that was not much money then, but it was enough for us to go into the District of Columbia with him and his students and ask them. We got 40 people and asked them, why is it that African Americans are reluctant to become donors? Now, it was interesting because before we started this 2-hour session with them, we did ask how many would sign donor cards. Only 2 out of 40 would sign donor cards. One happened to be a recipient and one was a donor. And so we spent the 2-hour sessions with them. And out of those 2-hour sessions, we got an understanding of why African Americans are reluctant to become donors. Secondly, we got an idea as to how to solve the problem. So it was $500 was well spent. Just to, I know you heard this forever, but the 5 reasons that they shared with us were: first, African Americans weren't aware of the need for transplants. They weren't aware that we are disproportionately afflicted and affected with hypertension and diabetes. They didn't know that we need organs more than anybody else. And so we need to become part of the solution to the problem. So the first issue was to address that. Second was religious myths and misperceptions. Concerned that in that great getting that morning, when you go to the pearly gates, you might need your eyes to see your great grandmama hereafter, or your heart, forgetting that it is in giving that you receive, it's in pardoning that your pardon is in dying, that you're born to eternal life. And Jesus Christ came and gave his life to save us so that we might have eternal life. So that it is the right and proper thing to do. But that was the second obstacle. The third had to do with the basic distrust of the healthcare community, because the healthcare community had taken advantage of them, had used minorities of all types as guinea pigs. And so the distrust issue was there. The fourth issue had to do with the basic fear. And if I sign a donor card and I go to the hospital, they might be more interested in getting my organs and tissues than with saving my life. And so we had to address that concern as well. And then the final one was racism, the fear that they just want to get my black organs to give to white people. So racism was the other fifth obstacle. But let me tell you, what we found out though was that at the end of the session, while only 2 out of 40 signed donor cards at the beginning of the session, at the end of our sessions, all 40 signed donor cards. So this said to us, not only have we identified the problem, we've identified a solution. So what we should do is take a group, just like the group that we use for our sessions, and go into the community and educate and empower. Now, this was interesting because at that time, it said Blacks don't donate. And you have the audacity to think that you're going to make a difference. And to be honest with you, I didn't, because I mean, it seemed like an impossible dream. But the fact is that we did decide to start a DC organ donor program. And that DC organ donor program, on the auspices of Howard and the National Kidney Foundation of DC, actually made a difference between 1978 and 1980, 85. We were able to double the number of people in the district, in Washington District of Columbia, as well as the surrounding area, double the number of African Americans who would sign donor cards and who actually would become donors. Because of that, members of the Dow Chemical Company, who developed Agent Orange, which needed a positive spin, heard what we were doing and actually gave a PR company, Golan Harris in Chicago, funds to take me across to 25 cities in the United States. As a consequence of that, they did a Dow Gallup poll in 1985 when we started, and another one in 1990. And the number of African Americans who would sign donor cards and who would actually recognize the need to be a transplant, to actually be aware of the need for transplant, had tripled. And so we had done what was said could not be done. We'd gone to the African American community, which they said wouldn't donate, and they actually did. And so with this having been accomplished, I then said, well, my goodness, they said it couldn't be done, and we did it. And if we could do it in the African American community, we could do it in all ethnic groups. And hence, we conceptualized the National Minority Organ Tissue Transplant Education Program to do what we effectively did in the African American community into all ethnic groups. We went to Congressman Stokes, who then introduced me to Lou Sullivan, who happened to be the Secretary of Health at the time. As a consequence of that meeting, he introduced me to John Ruffin, who ran the Office of Minority Affairs in National Institutes of Health. As a consequence of that, and them accepting my ideas about this new idea of MOTAP, over the next 15 years, between 1993, we conceptualized MOTAP in 1991. Between 1993 and 2011, the National Institutes of Health gave us some $16 million to go across the country and to set up 15 sites, which involved all of the ethnic groups, the Native American, the Latino Hispanic, African American, the Filipinos in Hawaii, and the Alaska Natives and the Native Americans. All of those groups had MOTEP sites. And as a consequence of that, what was remarkable is that the number of minorities that donated as a result of that doubled. And the number of African Americans who donated quadrupled. And so you asked me about MOTEP. That's what MOTEP was founded upon, and that's what MOTEP accomplished. Taking something that was successful in the African American community and applied it to all the other ethnic groups within it. And as a consequence of that, the number of minorities donations doubled. And so that's how MOTEP was formed. And praise be to God. To me, I consider it a miracle that we could do something so simple, and something that was impossible actually became possible.
Thank you. And it sounds like with MOTEP that you in some sense solved or gave us the direction for a solution of something that I think a lot of transplant centers, particularly academic transplant centers that have historically been siloed from the communities that we serve. It seems like one of the successes of MOTEP was to take this educational message and activity directly to the communities and involve the community.
The essence of our success is because of community education and empowerment. We actually did nothing more than go to the community, educate them, and let them take the message, because we learned that it's not about awareness, it's about changing behavior. And the community is the most effective change agent. And so we went to the community, educated them, and empowered them to do the job. They then did the job spectacularly. And so that's what MOTEP does more than anything else. So now over time, we learned that it's not enough just to worry about donors. You have to go in and address the fact that minority communities have more kidney disease than anybody else. And we have to prevent the need. Learn to love yourself, take care of yourself. That evolved over time. And also the AAA effect, the fact of going from awareness, starting with awareness, going from awareness to action to accountability. And that's what MOTEP really has been all about. Community, education, empowerment, getting the community to love themselves, take care of themselves, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, and also increasing donation rates.
Fantastic, fantastic. Thank you. Circling back a little bit to Howard University, I wonder if you would comment a little bit on just the importance of having a transplant center, at an HBCU, what that meant to you and what you think it meant to the community that was served.
Well, I think one thing that I didn't mention, the thing that motivated me more than anything else when I started the transplant program was that I recognized that most of the donors for my Black patients were white. And we needed to do something to change that so that the African American community can become part of it. And sometimes I often didn't realize at the time that starting that transplant center was one of the most important ways to actually conceive and make MOTEP become a reality. Because when I looked at the fact that Blacks were not donating, I realized that this was awful, and we need to become part of the solution to the problem. Now, because of my religious background, I recognized that one of the first places to start was the church. And so we went to the churches, and initially it was tough. But over time, because people in the church needed transplants more than anybody else, they became part of the solution to the problem as well.
Interesting. And I wonder, just thinking about your practice, how do you think your religious background and your work as a missionary is to inform your practice as a transplant surgeon?
I think, it's funny. The question you ask is such a great one, because as I look back over my life and my career, from the time I was born until now, I've been taking a path that seems to have been led by God above. I was once criticized by somebody who called me an opportunist. Well, I probably am an opportunist in the sense that when problems came my way, I didn't talk about the fact that I had pulmonary tuberculosis and I had a lobectomy when I was 15. I was in the hospital for 18 months. So I learned how to deal with the impossible. And the time I had TB, they had no effective treatment for it. And so I'd learned how to deal with the impossible things because I believed in God and I had faith in God. And I felt that there's no impossible dream. There's no mountain I can't climb because of my faith in God. And I think, as your question implied, this is the background that made everything possible for me. My faith in God and really believing that there's no mountain that I can't climb and there's no impossible dream. And if I believed in God, everything was possible. And this then was the foundation of what has led me to become who I am today.
Tremendous. Thank you. Thank you for that. I wonder, you are clearly one of the leaders in transplantation and have a lot of experience. And I just wonder if you would comment a little bit as we're, this is our diversity, equity, inclusion committee. Speak a little bit about some of the diversity challenges within transplantation.
I laugh because if you ask me what are the most important thing I've done in my career, MOTAP would be number 2. My number 1 feat that I think I've played a major role in is equitable allocation. When I started out in transplantation, there was racial discrimination. The HLA-A and HLA-B antigens were used to discriminate against people of color who didn't have the same kind of HLA antigens and HLA-B antigens that others did. But yet that was used to allocate organs, and that was racially discriminatory. And myself and Dr. Starzl worked hard to make these changes happen. And they actually happened. As I look back, the 3 things that I've played a role in. One is to eliminate the HLA antigens, which was done as a reason for allocating organs. Second was eliminating HLA-B. And then the third thing that happened, which I played a minor role in, but I certainly was thrilled when UNOS finally accepted the Eurotransplant model that did away with the waiting time that was falsely positioned, in which if you got on the waiting list, you would accumulate time. But if you had doctors who told you don't need to get on the waiting list, then that put us in a disadvantage. And so those 3 things I think helped accomplish equitable allocation. We aren't there yet, but we're a lot closer because we've dealt with those things. And I played a minor role with the Eurotransplant, but a major role with the HLA-A and HLA-B elimination. And so that to me is the most important thing I've done in my career, trying to bring equitable allocation to us as well as to all other ethnic groups.
Thank you. Those were tremendous. I think I remember when each of those changes happened and the positive impact it had on the equity of the allocation system. So,
yeah, I remember one of the most fascinating meetings I've ever been to was a meeting in which there was a vote on whether HLA-B would be eliminated. And in that meeting, there was a vote to not do that. And I was on the UNOS board at the time. And so I witnessed the vote. Winifred Williams was with me as well. And they voted against it. And it was interesting because shortly thereafter at lunchtime, it became clear that this was not the thing to do because it would not sit well with anyone. The Department of Health and Human Services or Division of Transplant or anybody for us to not do what needed to be done. And lo and behold, after lunch, vote was retaken and the vote, and it was overturned. And so we then had the elimination of racial AB. So, you know, I have been thrilled that I could play a role, and I think a lot of that is related to the fact that, to something you mentioned, as a transplant center director at Howard University, I could speak out and have my job. A lot of people who had my complexion, who spoke out, never came back to the meetings. But I could because I was at Howard University. And that bully pulpit that I got being at Howard University made a difference. So in many ways, every step that I've taken along the way, the Howard University Transplant Center, Immunogenetic Dialysis and Transplant Center, all of those things help me accomplish whatever I've accomplished in medicine, and to be able to play a role in getting equitable allocation, even though we're not all the way there yet. I'm thrilled and excited that I could have participated in that. And then, of course, the second accomplishment is, of course, MOTAP, which I'm thrilled and excited that I could play the role that I've played in MOTAP, and to see the difference. You know, I was actually astounded in 2011 when I looked at the UNOS results of, to find that the #1 ethnic group that was leading in organ donation in the United States was African Americans. That was a shock.
It's amazing after, like you said, over that 30-year period, and then it's really just completely flipped through these kind of efforts.
Yeah, that was a reward.
So given some of these accomplishments, what are your thoughts about what are some of the challenges, the current transplant challenges you see are kind of the greatest challenges in transplantation today?
Well, I think your group has done a great job in terms of recognizing that equity is the issue, diversity and equity. You know, it's interesting. Solomon first talked about equity way back thousands of years ago. And it's taken us a long time to understand. For example, you have a group that's boldly against racism. But what you're really trying to accomplish is to get diversity. Diversity, the business world knows that diversity is critical. And that's why they are doing that. So we as a transplant community have to be boldly trying to get equity as well. And diversity is what gets you to the top. And so finally, it's thrilling and exciting to see that your group is doing what it is doing today, because diversity is the answer.
Well, thank you. Thank you. What keeps you in transplantation and committed to transplantation?
What was your question again?
So what keeps you currently committed to transplantation?
Well, I'm excited to be alive. Every day I wake up, I'm thrilled. And to make any contribution, people ask me to do something, answer is always yes if I can. And it's exciting to see the people who I've trained and who one of my trainees, he'll be embarrassed for me to say this, is Bo Kelly. He's one of my first Dow Callender fellows. And to see him become what he is today, and to see so many people I've trained to become what they are today, I'm just thrilled and excited. That's what keeps me going. I'm thrilled to wake up and see my trainees and people who followed after me, and Sam Kuntz, of all the things that I've done in my career, the one thing that I am least happy with is the fact that I wanted to do 2 more Samuel Kuntz conferences. I did that right after he died. I did 4 of them, but I should have done 2 more, and I wish I had done that. So of the things that I haven't done that I should have done, those are 2 things that I wish I could have done. I didn't do that, and I didn't write. I knew Sam well, and I didn't write his story either. So those are 2 things that that I should have done. I also should write my own life story, but haven't done it either. So there's a number of unfinished things that I have yet to do, and I guess that's what keeps me going. Till I've accomplished those things, I'll feel that I haven't done what I need to do.
Right. So a couple more things on the agenda then. Well, just in looking back on your career and thinking about it, talk about maybe some of the difficulties that you had in your career, and how you overcame them.
Yeah, you know, when I first started out, I was a Lone Ranger. A Lone Ranger for many things, and I was the only Black African-American transplant surgeon in a sea of whites. And you know, if I said something, if somebody white didn't support it, then it was lost. But that didn't stop me from talking. And so I kind of got the reputation as being a loud mouth, and I was very unpopular. But that didn't bother me because I knew I had a mission, and so I just did what I felt I had to do to accomplish that mission. And I always wondered why people didn't like what I was saying, but it never really bothered me that they didn't like what I was saying, because I knew what I was saying was accurate, and I felt that I was created to do it, and so I did it. And fortunately, I was at Howard, and as a consequence, I could speak out boldly and still be a transplant surgeon and still be able to speak out. One of the greatest obstacles that I fought and lost, continue to lose, is the battle against people believing that we're different races. 2001, the Human Genome Project identified that we are one race. We're all Homo sapiens, but yet the social construct is killing us because we keep believing that we're different race. We're all Homo sapiens. And yeah, I battled that for decades, and I'm losing the battle, but I'm going to keep fighting for it. But I think that's an issue that we need to understand, that a race is a social construct. We have different ethnicities, and we have different backgrounds, different cultures, but we're all human beings. We're all Homo sapiens.
I will tell you had some impact. I will tell you, after hearing you talk about race and ethnicity in all of the presentations I'm fortunate to do, I've gone through and taken race out of all of my slides and replaced it with ethnicity. So I was listening.
Well, I'm happy to hear that.
So it's had some impact. There's a question in the chat from Marie Chisholm Burns that asks, during your time in transplant, to comment on how the landscape of transplant has changed or stayed the same for diverse transplant professionals in transplant and for the diverse patient population.
Well, you know, it's one of the most positive things I've seen over time. I remember when it was just myself and Sam, and then 1 or 2 others. And now it seems as though there's probably maybe about 30 or 40 people of color who are transplant surgeons, transplant physicians. And so the landscape has changed, and it needs to change even more. The area that I think that it hasn't changed and needs to change more is in the administration of transplantation with the OPOs. There's so few people of color at the top. And I think we need to do something about that. For example, in the NBA and the NFL, they have groups overseeing and grading them on their diversity. And we need to have the same thing for OPOs. And yeah, I've been outspoken about that too, but that's something that needs to be done. We need to have more people look like us at the top, not just in the middle or the bottom, but also at the top. And so I think that we're beginning to see that in transplant. Your group has done a great job of talking about boldly against racism and talking about how we need to diversify. And I think that that is coming. It's not there yet, but it's something that must come. And as we train our transplant surgeons to become transplant surgeons, we have to educate them about the importance of the community, educating the community, empowering the community, and diversifying.
Thank you. Just building on that a little bit, as you talked about the training aspect, maybe if you would expand a little bit more on what changes in surgical in particular, but in that medical training you think might benefit the patients we serve.
Well, I think that one of the things we almost never do is we don't deal with the implicit biases of our renal physicians, transplant surgeons, or even the nurses as well. And we all have implicit biases. So we need to have sessions in which these are dealt with at all levels. We also need to spend more time ensuring that the materials that our patients read is at the appropriate health literacy level, and that they really understand. As a transplant surgeon and you as a transplant physician, you know that the law requires that the patients decide yay or nay about transplantation, but there's nothing there that says they have to understand what they're signing. And a lot of times they sign it, but they don't know what they're signing. Do they know the data? Or do they understand the data? Is the data presented in a fashion they can really read and understand? I think not. And I think that is an area of development. I've seen a lot of work done recently in the Latino Hispanic community in Northwestern and in the African American community in Northwestern. And the thing that they do that all groups need to do is to be sure that people understand what they're doing and not just give them a piece of paper to sign, but to be sure that they really are given the information in a fashion that they can interpret it and make the right decisions. I also think that very often we don't spend as much time as we should recognizing that we don't know all the answers. As it relates to the white community, we may, but as it relates to the minority communities, I'm not sure we do. And I think more of the trials and the studies need to have more of a diversity participation. I saw a study recently in which they talked about the unknown causes of kidney disease. But in that study, they had about less than 8% of minorities total. And so I think that we need more participation. Some of it is because our communities don't trust us. But whatever it is, that's something that we need to spend a lot more time ensuring that in all of the studies that we do, that we work hard to ensure that minority participation. For example, we did that with the COVID vaccine and did the trials. We need to do the same thing with all of our end-stage renal disease studies.
Thank you. That's critically important. Sounds like thinking about representation across the spectrum from the patients to research all the way through the providers. What with the work in MOTEP, what were some of the most effective educational tools or educational messages you found in the work with MOTEP that we might apply to some of this other transplant work?
One thing that I recognized early was that the voice that needs to be heard is not my voice. It's the voice of the person who's received a transplant, the person who's waiting for a transplant, the person who's donated. And those are the voices that people listen to, particularly if they are from their similar ethnic group. and they speak the same language. And so recognize this and understanding that one of the most effective change agents we have is the community itself becomes something that I think becomes priority.
Great, great. To our audience, we have time for some questions for Dr. Callender. So if you have questions, please go ahead and put that in the Q&A and we'll try to address those. And then in the meantime, I wonder if I could ask you, you've been such a leader in transplantation. Who were the most influential people to you in your career and in transplantation?
Well, I think that in all honesty, I think my wife and my family and my relationship with God are number one. John Nigerian, Richard Simmons, Tom Starzl, all of those people helped me. Dr. Ramonia Chapman helped me as much as anybody else in terms of getting the message out about MOTEP. And so that's my answer to you. My relationship with God, my family, my mentors, and then of course, people like Bill Motori at Howard University, LaSalle Lafall, Wayne Frederick, the president at Howard University now, Eddie Cornwell, and all those people have made a difference. You know, I'm not a particularly brilliant guy. You know, truth be told, you know, I finished Hunter College with a grade point average of 2.5. So I'm not that smart. And the guy who said I'm an opportunist might be right about me. But I have my faith in God and believe that all things are possible. There's no impossible dream. There's no unreachable star. And I believe that's what's made a difference for me in my whole life.
Perfect. Sounds like you just hadn't peaked yet.
I'm sorry?
When you were at Hunter College, it sounds like you just hadn't peaked yet, that you just needed a few more years.
I was very, you know, one of the problems with me at Hunter College is that I already knew that I was going to be a medical missionary. So when and I was very immature. I mean, I got a D in English and history because I don't need those when I'm gonna be a doctor. And I was ignorant, and so I was very immature. And so maybe they're right about me. My teacher told me that I would never be a doctor. She said that I didn't have what it takes. I felt sorry for her because I recognized she didn't understand that I served a God for whom nothing is impossible. But then I also met a professor at Hunter College, Dr. Crydell, who introduced me to physiology. And because of that, I finished number one in my class in medical school after having a 2.5 average at Hunter College. So anyway, I just point out that it's not that I'm brilliant, it's that my faith in God and my belief that I can do it no matter what others say has made a difference in my life and my career.
Tremendous, tremendous. I may disagree with you on the brilliant part, but we have a question from Dr. Mann, and Rosalind asks, as we struggle to improve access to transplantation to all patients, should we consider refining the evaluation process so patients limited resources can multiple list?
I think absolutely yes. I think that many of the groups that are becoming successful are groups that are actually going into the community and getting people like champions from the community to help and be advocates. Of course, in this time of COVID, it's tough to do any of that. But as we get out of the COVID atmosphere, we need to be more socially conscious, have a social conscience, and cater to the resources that our community have. You know, the social determinants of health are not just a coined word, they are the reality. And I think that question points out that we have to be more resourceful to make sure that all of our customers, patients are addressed in the fashion that they can understand what we're talking about.
That does require really a cultural change in the transplant community and transplant centers and how we approach the care of patients.
Yeah, I believe so. And I'm not sure that we recognize that yet. And I think that that's one of the important lessons as we go forward, that we recognize that the social determinants of health play a critical role in all groups, and especially in those who are the underserved. And those who speak different languages or have different disabilities and different learning styles, all of those become important. They have not been in the past, but they need to be in the future.
So we have an additional question from Dr. Mannon talking about xenotransplantation. And mentioning with that coming into view as a potential solution to the organ crisis, how do we propose the opportunities for xenotransplantation fairly to patients, again, who may be limited in terms of access or resources?
This is a good example of the importance of letting the community be involved in all aspects of what we do. Xenotransplantation, stem cell transplantation, tissue reengineering is our future. We must, however, be sure that as we take every step, the community is part of that. Xenotransplantation is something that has great potential because we know that, at least I know, that we are unlikely to ever have enough human organs. But if we have a process as we have now that allows for xenotransplants to be successful, we have a process that allows for stem cell transplantation to take place, we have a process that allows for reengineering, then we must go there. But we must go there at the same time, bringing the community along with us. And to the extent that we do that, then we will be successful. To the extent that we don't do it, we will be unsuccessful. Because it's not enough just to know how to do things. It's know how to do them with the community along with us.
And then we have a question, perhaps a little more controversial area, related to preemptive waitlisting. And the question is, do you think patients should be able to get preemptive waiting time on the kidney transplant list prior to dialysis? Or do you think that preemptive waiting time further perpetuates disparity in access for minority patients?
Well, I think it would unfairly work against the minority patient. Here's the problem. Most of our minority patients don't have the diagnosis of end-stage renal disease made until they have to go on dialysis. There are a number of issues that need to be addressed simultaneously. We don't have a situation that allows the primary care doctors to recognize that screening is important and that spilling protein is one of the earliest signs of kidney disease for many diseases. If that became an important part of the workup for all patients of all ethnic groups, especially those of minority groups, then we might make the diagnosis earlier. In that case, it would not act against those people who are in the so-called minority family. So that I do not agree with that concept at this time, because I don't think it's fair. And I think that the way to make it fair is to recognize that earlier diagnosis is critical. And we're not doing that for many of the minority populations. And so the first step I would take is to make that part of the workup, that you get renal screening. And then also, we haven't talked about, and you know very well about this, because you actually enlisted me. But you know very well that Many times we make diagnosis of hypertension, kidney disease, diabetic kidney disease, and we don't really know what the cause of the disease is. And I think this affects minorities more than anybody else. And that's why I do not agree with the preemptive waiting list.
Fair enough. Dovetailing on that discussion about diagnosis, there's a question just to hear your thoughts about living kidney donation and the use of APOL1 screening in the evaluation of African-American donor candidates.
Great question. It's interesting because the data is not yet out, and there's many thoughts about if you have homogeneity or heterogeneity relative to APOL1, whether it's going to make a difference. And I think until we've done all the studies that need to be done, and there's national studies that are in the process, until then, I think it's premature to make any decision about that. I've seen a lot of the data, and I'm sure that if you're homogeneous relative to having that APOL1 gene, that may mean that you can't be a donor. But I want to have all the data out first before we can presume that somebody is not a good donor because of the heterogeneity or homogeneity of the APOL1 gene.
Thank you. Thank you. And then perhaps one more question as we begin to wrap up. And there's a question from Derek Amenador. How do we continue to increase recognition for historically Black institutions like Howard for the efforts that they've played in programs like MOTEP?
Well, you know, that's a tough question because I don't know that we need any special recognition. I mean, we do what we do because we care for our people. I don't need any reward for that. My reward is the fact that you are getting better and that we're getting fair share of what we should get. And that's the reward. That's the only reward I need. Actually, I'm thrilled that I can participate and to have played a role in helping equitable allocation and increasing the number of minority donors. And so I'm just thrilled and excited and don't need any rewards. My reward is what I see happening and seeing so many people of color in transplantation now as transplant physicians, transplant surgeons, and transplant providers of all sorts. That's my reward. And that's all the reward I need. Of course, that it may sound funny because let's face it, I'm a transplant surgeon, and so I'm not poor. I mean, I'm not poor, so maybe I already have my reward. I'm not rich, but I'm not poor either, and I'm happy. I mean, that beats everything. I'm happy. I'm a proud father of 3, grandfather of 2. And I got a wife who loves me and has been with me for 53 years. So, I mean, how can you ask for anything more? Happiness is what it's all about. And that's what I'm enjoying right now. And I wish you could enjoy it like I am enjoying it. But I don't need any other rewards. I've got so many awards. And the greatest joy I have, and I'm sure Silas understands it, is seeing a grateful patient and having a patient say thank you. And then the next reward I have is that my students who I've trained and who maybe thought I was an awful teacher at one point, but then 5 or 10 years later come to me and say, you know, you prepared me for life. How can you get a greater reward than that?
Can't go wrong. Well, with that, I think that's tremendous. I just want to, as we close out, just thank you for joining us today, for sharing some of your wisdom and experiences with us today. Tremendous conversation. I wish we could continue to talk, but I just want to thank you so much for joining us today. Thank the audience for joining us as well.
Thanks for having me. Dr. Norman. It's a joy to be with you again.
Wonderful. I hope to see you soon. And
Yeah, I do too.
all
Right.
right. Wish everybody a good afternoon.
Okay. All right.
Thank you. Tremendous.